So I'll start by introducing our two guests for today. So we have two prestigious IABC Fellows and experts in communications. So first, Gloria Walker, who's a strategic communications consultant. She's also an author, researcher, and associate lecturer at the London College of Communication. And as well, we have Mike Klein, who's a comm strategist who leads Changing the Terms, a research-driven consultancy. He's editor-in-chief of Strategic, and he's also the founder of the We Lead Comms program that many of us probably know. And so, as Monique was mentioning, we're delighted to have two people from the EMENA region to be named as IABC Fellows. And so today we're going to look at essentially, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities facing comms today, and what can we learn from these two illustrious people and leaders in the comm profession. So first, let's dive in. I think, the first question, um, I remember, when I was in university and, I was managing external relations, and I got a software for my computer that allowed me to send a press release, all at once directly from my computer. This was a game changer for me back in the days when I was
Yeah.
in university. So things have changed so much over the past couple of decades. What have been some of the big changes that you've seen in the comms profession? And how has it evolved up to today?
Well, I think I'll start with that one because I've been giving this quite a bit of thought because I've been having conversations with people in other organizations about, what kind of represents what we do. And looking back over my career, I mean, I'm even before computers. If we did a publication, we had to go send it off and have the galleys set, and they would come back. We'd have to cut them and good old rubber cement down on the thing and off to the printer. So it was took so much more time to do things as we used to do them. And then I still remember my CompuServe address, because that was what we had when the computers first came in. And I remember my boss at the time, so I was in London by then, was very upset that I was on the internet because people were afraid of it and having, information stolen and not having control over what we were doing. That eventually kind of disappeared. But one of the things that's been constant through communications has been, used to be a lot longer, but there would be another tool that would come along that we could use. So from newspapers, which dominated, and magazines, then radio shows up. What do we do with that? Then television in the 60s, how that changed what we did, and how advertising could be conducted. It had a big impact on many aspects of life. And then, the computer showed up, we had the internet, and then here comes social media, which again changed how we did things, created opportunities, but also, created problems. And I know there's an IABC Circle of Fellows event later this week looking at disinformation and misinformation, which is something we've had to deal with for a long time. But now it all happens so fast that it's hard to keep up with what's out there. And I think it raises an issue about, trust, but can we trust the information that we're getting? Where does that information come from? Anybody can set up a blog or a podcast and put things out there. Well, who are they? What makes them credible? So source credibility, I think, is an issue that we are continuing, and Mike shaking his head, that we are, very much having to focus on. The UK chapter, we had a session with a BBC fact checker, and he talked about the tools that he uses because a lot of the information that comes through, he doesn't know if it's true or not, because anybody can say anything. And a lot of people, if I look at the American political situation and some of the things that my son sends me, people just believe the most amazing things just on face value. And I think for the communications profession, with AI and everything else that we have to use, source credibility is a big issue. And I think that's going to challenge us going forward.
From
Mike?
my perspective, I see a number of things in terms of the evolution of the profession. Setting aside technology, setting aside AI, setting aside the changes in the tools that we've been dealing with. Some things have changed, some things have yet to change. The things that have changed, certainly some of the topics that we deal with have changed. So we've kind of moved from morale improvement to awareness to at least some conversation about the extent to which we actually drive outcomes or performance in organization, whether it's commercially or whether it's internally. There's definitely been some upgrading of that conversation. At the same time, I'm very active in internal communication and communication leadership circles. And one of the biggest complaints that people have is that the conversation hasn't changed for 20, 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I do see some indication that we can help change that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That our mentality, our mindset, our approach, by being more proactive and by being more conscious of the impact we actually have, we're in more and more of a position to own the influence and exert more influence in our organizations and communities. But, you know, a lot of that's up to us. And, there have been some detours. For example, on the internal side, when I got started, there was some thought that internal comms was going to be the next great management consultancy discipline. And then a certain phrase that starts with the letter E, namely employee engagement, pretty much turned over the apple cart for about 20 plus years. And we're really only starting to get out from under that. The challenge with linking internal communication with employee engagement is that A, employee engagement has no actionable definition. And B, internal communication has very little to do with the things that employee engagement is measured on. And so that really sucked a lot of energy and life out of us for the last 20 years. And we're really only starting to see, things on the demand side moving beyond that. And that's, I think, one area where AI is a bit of a bonus for us is that there's now some appetite for us to do other things. Now, we can do more to create that appetite. I mean, I can see us changing the conversation for the next 10 years. More than a lot of stuff over the last 20. I mean, we've evolved despite ourselves and despite the market that we've been in. But I think that the next 10 years can be quite exciting if we play our cards right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But, one of the challenges here is also that, we're always pushed to do more with less. I did a pulse survey, and the number one challenge for communication professionals was, the lack of time and resources. So how, in that case, how can we kind of balance, this need for strategic influence and kind of the day-to-day demands of the job?
I
You want
think,
me to take this?
yeah, go ahead. Do you want me to take it or you want to start?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. One of the things that I think has been a challenge for communicators is how we're perceived. We're recognized as having a specific skill set, but one of the things we are not recognized for is having an understanding of our organizations and what they are trying to accomplish. Because what we do has to move the organization forward. So we have to understand business, basically. And, what is driving things in the C-suite? What are their concerns? And how can we use communications to address those issues? Because I was thinking this morning, the role of the CEO, which is one of the things we talk about in my class. The CEO is a communicator. Some are better than others, but they distribute messages. They are out interfacing with stakeholder groups. And a lot of times it's, they'll say, oh, I need a speech, or I need this, or I need that, put a presentation together kind of thing. I know my approach to those things was, okay, what is it what is it we're trying to accomplish? What are the key issues that you want to talk about? Because I spend a lot of my time career-wise in public affairs, where it's very much about what are we doing to address these particular issues. And I think until communicators kind of begin to bridge that gap between understanding the organization and what it wants to accomplish and how we use the tools that we have to make that happen, if we're only ever seen as doers and not thinkers, not contributing to organizational strategy, then we've still got this perception issue that we've had forever.
I think we have the tools to fight that with, if we're willing to do that. Now, part of that has to do with mindset. When we say we've got too much to do, that's often used as an excuse not to do more. And it's totally understandable, but it totally feeds this whole vicious cycle that we're in. One piece of advice that I give people that's probably one of my more controversial, and I give it consistently, is that if you are at 100% capacity, the only way to get out of it is to find an extra 10% of capacity for a short period of time so that you can demonstrate stuff that actually adds value to be able to reduce the demand for the other stuff. And a lot of people aren't willing to do this. A lot of people say, we've got too much to do, or they're not giving me enough credit, and they descend into a victim mentality around this. And that, I think, is probably the single biggest derailer of the entire contribution that not only they can make, but that we all can make. And so the more we summon up that extra 10% for the short term to be able to turn the narrative around, the better we're going to be positioned. And that 10% may be studying the business. It may be finding a half hour for an extra interview with the C-suite member who's willing to talk to you to get that insight about what's keeping them up at night. Or it may just simply be finding a tool or finding an exercise that you can stick in front of leadership, like asking a qualitative question to 20 people. What are the top 3 priorities facing the organization? You ask 20 people this, and then you say, guess what? I just asked a random 20 people, and they're saying completely different stuff than you're saying. Do you really need to be having me spend time putting posters around the office?
I think there's
We've
another
got to find, something to crack that consensus.
when you get the, oh, we need to do this. And it's like, okay, so what do you want me to not do? What do you want me to stop doing? Or, okay, but that's going to add to the budget. Because they always understand the money question. How much is that going to cost? Because, we've all got a certain number of hours in the day. And yeah, we can take more on and take more on and take more on and not really accomplish much. So I think part of it is making the people asking, okay, what are the priorities? What do you want me to focus on? Because, we can't do everything. And sometimes we're doing things that really are not adding value. They're busy work, or we've done it because we've always done it. I'm a great advocate for research. Find out, what do people want? What is valued? Do we need to do everything? Because everything isn't going to, move the needle very far. It might, oh, this is fun, we enjoy doing it. But again, what is it contributing to the organization? So I have found asking questions when they come in with, oh, we've got to do such and such. Well, let's have a conversation about that.
So you're both kind of in the same vein, talking about, Mike's talking about having, doing small experiments, and you're looking at, doing research. So different
Mhm.
ways in which we can kind of elevate the discussion
Mhm.
around sort of more strategic issues that can then resonate at the C-suite level, right?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and also being able to bring data to the table that justifies the the pushback. I mean, the concern that I have about just simply saying, what do you want me to stop? Is that it makes the communicator potentially seem lazy to the leader. And, everybody in the organization is under pressure. And, there's an expectation in some places that employees should be able to handle whatever assignments they're given.
Mm.
So, I would caution against that kind of approach unless you've got data that says we need to focus on this and not that.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And actually, that of course, there's always this kind of like comment that communicators should have more influence at the leadership table. So, what for you two? What has been kind of a tangible example? Not talking about sort of like a sort of a strategy document or something, but what are some tangible examples of how you've seen comms to be gain more influence at the C-suite level?
Well, for me, the key has been to find C-suite allies. So if you've got a C-suite that's got 10 people in it, even if 8 of them think that internal comms is a waste of time and they should just be able to tell people what to do and have it get done simply because of that, you're going to find 2 or 3 people who are a bit more ambitious who are going to say, if somebody can help me get my stuff achieved and it's not going to cost me any more time or money, why wouldn't I do this? So you find some allies, you get them to sing your praises, you get them to role model how to work with you. That can buy you some time, some longevity, and some influence.
I think part of the issue is what area of communications do you work in, and how is that particular area regarded? Like I said, I spent a lot of my career in public affairs, dealing with issues in UK government, but also with the European Union. Um, and these were issues that were identified by the C-suite, because my responsibility was to bring things in and say, okay, this is what they're looking at that could possibly affect us. Do we want to, put some resource into this? Um, when you're dealing with legislative issues that can have a direct impact on the business, then you have their attention. And I had one managing director. We were going to do a briefing to some members of the European Parliament and some civil servants. And he was in a conference in Chicago. And I called him and said, okay, we've got this briefing set up. This is when it is. I said, you'll be in Chicago. He said, no, I won't. And he got on a plane and flew back so that he could attend and be part of that. So it's how they regard different aspects of communications. And I think it goes back to how are we addressing issues that matter to the organization, whether it's we've got a problem with safety, which has a direct impact on the bottom line. We've got high employee turnover. How do we address that? A lot of times it can be little things that employees are upset about that can easily be changed, that again impact productivity, impact quality of what the employees do. So I think that in my experience, understanding the issues and identifying the issues and then taking steps to address. But I think we also have to educate the people in the C-suite and the management teams and next levels and whatever about what communications really is. And yes, what they see is what they think we do, and that's it. So they see newsletters, they see stuff, but that stuff is really just representing all the strategic work that we're doing behind the scenes. And I think that's a bit of a disconnect that we need to address.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The effectiveness of what we do is in what the organizations don't do. What we stop them from doing, what they what bad impulses we
That's not
constrain, et cetera. And that's hard to quantify. I mean, the way I encourage people to demonstrate ROI is to focus on showing that the tangible ROI is enough to justify your existence. And then the rest of the stuff is just bonus, basically. But,
yeah.
most of us can create business cases that say, you're spending 150,000 bucks on internal communication, or, $500,000 on your communication function. And here's what wouldn't happen if we weren't here. And then you put a dollar sign on it and say, do you really want to throw 5 million, 50 million bucks out the window because you saved 200 bucks on a couple of staff people?
Mm.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to, we were talking about the C-suite. What is the language used in the C-suite? And these people are numerical.
Mm-hmm.
These are people who look at data every day, who are looking at sales figures or, projections, or, oh, we lost this contract, or, all these business issues. So again, it's, how do we help address those? And I think once we can, get that understanding, then, we find ourselves doing a lot more and having support for what we do.
Mm.
But it's like I said, I've been in this business a very long time, and we've had the same conversation all those years.
Yeah.
What's the challenge? And I think part of it is the fact that, and it's just a fact. Communications, I know in the U.S. and even here in the U.K., communication sits in social sciences, or has its own school or whatever. Business is over there. So even in education, we have this gap, and I think that is a gap we need to begin bridging, because I know in my graduate class we talk a lot about business issues, because it's a class on reputation management, and reputation is about how the business is perceived.
Mm-hmm. So we have
Another aspect of working with leaders. I mean, most people, building on Gloria's point that most of the people that we deal with are numerical. There's two sides of it. One is most of the people who we deal with tend to have basically accountancy or engineering backgrounds. So they're not just numerical, they're also linear.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the stuff that we do isn't linear. It's either systemic or it's binary. You either do it or you don't. You can't spend 50,000 bucks to do something that costs 100. You're either doing it or you don't. And so we need to be able to not only speak their language, but to be able to use their language to bring them into our reality.
Yeah. Which means we have to educate ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And I'll ask actually any of the participants if they'd like to ask any questions as well in the chat. Please feel free. Monique has added to Gloria's comments about bridging the gap with some insights there that you can refer to as well. That looks quite interesting. And I think that for me, following up on that, what are some we had recently a webinar with Matt Tidwell about the challenges now of hybrid work, remote work, and basically how that's affecting corporate culture, and how Gen Z is dealing with that. Now, what would be your advice for someone that's looking to use basically, leverage the power of internal comms to change corporate culture? What are some case studies or some experiences that you've had where comms has really played a leading role in the corporate culture?
I was working on a project with a colleague in South Africa with their pension group that represents their pension funds. And one of the pension funds, their members are truckers, and there's lots and lots of truckers across South Africa going into other, African countries. they did some work because they wanted to be able to communicate well, and they did some work to find out what would be the most effective way to do that. So instead of just making an assumption, again, they went and did their research and asked, okay, how do you want to get information? What would be useful for you? And they started using, mobile text messaging, because all these folks have phones. And even though, and they started using audio as well, because literacy is an issue in some places in the world. So you can't just assume that because we do it one way, one place, that it's going to be effective everywhere. One of the things I've learned in my career, we talk about diversity, and I've worked in lots of different places around the world. We need to be aware of different cultures and how different cultures communicate and what works in those cultures, what is effective with those folks to get messages out. Because if you start handing out a whole bunch of, newsletters and whatever, it may not be effective. And then you're wondering why nobody's paying attention, why we're not getting our message across. So I think we as communicators have a responsibility to really understand who it is we are communicating to and what's the most effective way to do that.
Well, I think there's another piece which is around recognizing the dynamics of communication, particularly in an organizational perspective. I mean, there's a huge gap in the way leaders perceive communication versus the way it actually works. Leaders tend to, particularly if they're our age or older and they're male, they kind of have a view that you say something and it gets transmitted from top to bottom and then stuff gets done. The cascading mentality. And it still persists because it's so intuitive and logical. The problem is it doesn't actually work because organizations are networks and not waterfalls. And being able to, organizations that have recognized the multi-directionality of communication and have gone through the effort of identifying internal influencers and taking conscious steps to connect different parts of the organization. Those change their culture. Once you've done that, they start to change their culture organically. Organizations that resist this find themselves changing their culture because they have to change a lot of employees and bring new people in the system because it breaks every so often and people leave because of it. So,
This whole concept of remote working isn't anything new. We've
no, I
always
mean,
had
we've had,
people who were, outside the office. I know when I was working in the oil business, all of our folks were out in the field. So I was out running around the oil field because I was the only person from head office they ever saw. So again, part of my responsibility was gathering information and then, okay, how can we address this issue? We need information on this, we need information on that. What's the best way to get that out? And a lot of times it wasn't through the normal channels that we had put in place. So again, sometimes you have to think outside the box or come up with a different approach to address what the employees are asking for.
We have a question now from Monique. What has helped most guide your career? I guess, what are some tools or references or different types of organizations, or how is how is your career? I guess what would have been some suggestions you would have?
well, I'll take this one. I think a few things. One is to have a really good idea of where you're coming from philosophically and background wise, because most of the people in communication don't come in through communication educational programs. They come in from other fields. Sometimes they come in by default. Sometimes they realize that they're good at it. Sometimes because they're tapped on the shoulder and said, "You're told you're doing that." And knowing where you're starting from. In my case, I came into business communication from political communication. So I take that frame, how do you, identify who your stakeholders are, who your constituencies are, who your audiences are, pick the word. And then you figure out, okay, what are each of them trying to achieve? And then how do you get to getting enough people, not getting everybody, but getting enough of the right people to move in that direction to push forward. But I mean, that's my approach. That's what I've been trained to do, and that's how I approach it. You all have other orientations, and you can either start from your own or consciously shift to another. And I know a lot of people who've taken particularly psychology degrees as, or behavioral degrees as a means of shifting their own perspective. I'd advise people to look at different fields from that, particularly sociology. I think the understanding of how groups of people operate is at least as important as understanding how individuals are.
Experiences.
I would be more creative in finding, different inputs rather than just simply doing what everybody else is doing.
I got into the field because my undergraduate degree is in public relations from way, way back. Um, and then I did a master's degree. So I always said that my undergraduate degree taught me how to do things, but my graduate degree explained why we do them. And I agree with Mike that having kind of a broader perspective on social issues, behavioral issues, because we're dealing with people and a wide variety of people who have their own backgrounds, their own stories. So again, another thing that I did that I found extremely helpful was I went through a facilitator training course that an organization here in London ran for 2 weeks. The lady who ran it was from Boston Consulting, and it was quite an eye opener in terms of how to work with people and listen to people. I think one of the big skill sets that we have to have as communicators is emotional intelligence. We have to be able to work with all kinds of people in all kinds of backgrounds and really listen to what it is, they are, whether they're the CEO or, the guy who stocks the coffee machine, whatever it is, because they all contribute to the organization in their own way. So understanding, their needs and how to interact with people, I think is a very important part of the skill set that we need to have to be effective communicators ourselves, because that helps us gather information that we can then bring into the job.
So staying curious is a
Staying
key
curious,
a key
continuing to
thing.
learn. Yeah.
There's a good episode from Ted Lasso if you haven't seen about specifically that topic. Another question now from Michael is, what is your advice for others who are thinking about the Fellows nomination? What are some do's and don'ts?
I
I,
think
I Go ahead.
understand the process. Go through the materials and see what it is they're looking for, what the requirements are, and think very carefully about who you want to ask to write your support letters, because that has a big impact as well. Mike?
I'd add two things. One is don't expect to get through on the first go. Um, Second is, in my case, when I didn't get through on the first go, it was 2018, and I didn't really bring the subject up again until somebody asked me if I wanted to be considered.
Mm.
Um, if you might want to wait a bit and see, particularly if you can get some feedback about what's missing in your initial application, and then go out and, I mean, this is if you want to go out to become a fellow. If you want to keep doing what you're doing and just keep, I mean, I didn't expect to become a fellow. I wanted to become a fellow, but I didn't expect it. So I've continued doing what I was doing as if this wasn't going to happen. So my invitation is, if you want to be a fellow, um, do close the gaps if that's a real interest to you.
Yeah.
But don't do it for the sake of trying to become a fellow.
No. I mean, like I said, in my case, somebody pushed me to do it because I've been a member of IABC for decades and just hadn't really, you know, thought about it or been that concerned about it until like somebody really started pushing hard for me to do this. In fact, I've had comments back from people saying, why did you wait so long? You should have done this years ago. Busy. It is time consuming to put it together. I was busy, so didn't really think about it. But if you want it, go through the material, see what they're asking for. See, as Mike's pointed out, do you have some gaps? And how can you fill those? So, but I found it a very enlightening process. I learned a lot. So, yeah, go for it.
Super. We have a question from Anne-Marie Blake as well. To what extent do you think the echo chamber of LinkedIn is helping or detracting from the important work we do as comms professionals? And I think that you can even talk about basically the echo chamber in other social media platforms. But essentially, it's basically, all that, the comment by Monique, which is all the noise online at the moment, a lot of rubbish, a lot of repurposed stuff or AI written stuff. What are your comments about this, and I guess the direction this is going to, and how to deal with it?
Well,
Mike, you're more active on LinkedIn than I am. So.
yes, I was about to say, as one of the louder voices in this space on LinkedIn, I have a few thoughts on this. One is that I don't necessarily think that what we're doing is detracting. Um, I think what we're doing is we're getting more people involved, we're getting more people engaged.
Mhm.
And because of that, other people are trying to come in and be a part of this conversation. And one of the problems, and comes back to this conversation hasn't changed for 20 years, is that new people are coming into the field and having what we would consider fairly pedestrian revelations and thinking that, oh my God, this is the most profound thing I've ever seen. I need to share it with people. And that's not going to change because the fundamental dynamics of the field won't change. Communication is about engaging people ultimately to move them in a particular direction. Those fundamentals aren't going to change regardless of how the tools change.
Yeah.
But that much being said, when you disagree with stuff, when you think stuff is boring rather than profound, you've got to call bullshit.
Mhm.
And I've done this, just in the last couple of weeks with fairly senior folks, with people saying, one person was saying, we're the people who make people do what organizations want to do, and I said, no, we aren't. And if we were to say that, we would deserve to get cracked for it. We give people the choice of doing stuff that they do, but ultimately that choice belongs with them and not with you. You know, and I called a fairly visible person in the space on it. Didn't get a response, but it's like if there's bullshit that's being distributed by people, particularly if you see it's got 10, 20, 100 likes, then go ahead and call bullshit.
A lot of what I see on LinkedIn is I think a lot of people use LinkedIn as, it's another channel for promotion. And that's fine. But like I say, I don't get out there, too much. I look at it every day, several times a day, and there are things that I see that I like that occasionally I'll comment. My favorite one is the guy who's offering AI training for women over 50. Kind of scratching my head on that one. So you see a lot of stuff out there, which is targeted at sales. Buy my this, buy my that, support me, and whatever it is. So I'm a bit bit leery of some of the stuff that I see. I use it to keep up with things that Mike puts out and other people put out that I respect, that I know there is again, I'm back to source credibility. So I know where this is coming from. A lot of it is just noise, people pushing their own boat. So again, I'm sort of discerning in what I actually follow.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
But
definitely,
I think it's an important channel.
yeah.
But again, it's another channel. It's another tool. How do we use it effectively? And now I'm seeing lots of, seminars on best way to use LinkedIn. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also, particularly if you're an independent, it
Mhm.
is hard, really hard to market your services in this space. And, perhaps I've overused LinkedIn over the years relative to the amount of direct result that I've gotten. But, it's also the only platform that allows a lot of scale and reach for
Yeah.
relatively limited investment.
Yeah.
And that's not going to change. Although LinkedIn is becoming less and less forgiving of organic reach, and increasingly I'm spending small but noticeable amounts of money to promote various things that I'm doing, just simply because the organic reach isn't there anymore. But I get that some people are approaching that by being louder and by being more persistent and by being perhaps even more aggressive.
Yeah.
I have a question, I guess, from your long experience, what
Long.
is one of the major challenges that you've faced in your career, and how did you overcome it? How can we learn from some of the biggest challenge that you've overcome?
I guess my biggest challenge was moving from Dallas to London and not knowing anybody, basically starting from scratch, because the market here was very different. It's still somewhat different. But I met people who said, geez, you're the first trained PR person I've ever met. Because everybody came into the field, they were a former financial journalist or property journalist or tech journalist or, or whatever. And I worked in financial PR at my first job. And it was what I called checklist PR, because it was all based on the reporting calendar, which was fine. But anytime you'd bring up something that was, oh, here's a business issue, do you want to raise this with the client? To say, no, it's not on our list. I thought, okay, this isn't going to be terribly helpful. One of the things that I guess got my career moving was joining IABC, because somebody, said, oh, you know about this from the States, so, you should join here. And that I'd been only working, I guess, about a year. And after I left, because I got told if I had another child, it would hurt my career, which I had another child. Anyway, so, there were other issues kind of going on. Welcome to financial PR. But people I knew in IABC had jobs. And most of the jobs that I've had here in the, nearly 40 years I've been here, have come through people I knew in IABC, through the network, not just here in the UK, but in other parts of the world as well. And that has, I cannot stress the importance of networking, the importance of being out there, the importance of participating and getting known through your networks. It made a huge difference. Basically, like I said, kept my career going, both for in-house jobs, and then when I left that, I worked for myself for years, and most of it came through people I knew through the chapter or the region or internationally, and that still applies today.
Mike?
Say two challenges. One was, in terms of like getting my business off the ground, um, shifting my focus on from trying to just get a few things and focusing on a few things to really having a lot of irons in the fire. Not that I had a lot, and in getting a lot of irons into the fire, I don't think I yielded more, but it took my mind off of obsessing about the most likely alternatives. And it also opened up other alternatives. The less you're focusing on, I've got this one thing and I really hope I get it. And I don't want to do anything else in case I get it, then I'm gonna have to drop it. You relentless diversification, relentless, whether it's application if you're looking for in-house jobs, or relentless, connection, not just to say, do you have something for me, but also how can you connect the people within your network with each other? Um, Not just because that's going to produce something for you in the near term, but that creates a network around you that's actually grateful to you for having put them together in the first place. So that's one thing. The second thing is, being able to recover from failure.
Mm.
About 7 years ago, I went in house for the last time. And I was there for about 6 months. It was a total disaster. And it took me about a year to recover from
Mm.
it. And really that involved just simply putting the track in front of yourself and continuing to, in front of myself and continuing to move every day until that wreckage was behind me. And we can, I'm happy to talk about it if anybody's curious, but resilience and actually doing stuff is absolutely, doing stuff to get beyond failure is absolutely critical as well.
Yeah. I mean, not everything works, and I think at some point, you lose a job or you don't get a contract or the contract gets canceled or, there's always something. And how do you respond to that?
Mhm.
Like I said, I was lucky in that, somebody else would call up and say, hey, come and do this, come and do that.
Mm.
So, I think in any field, networking, getting to know people, putting yourself out there is important. And I think too, if you have a question, drop somebody a line and say, hey, could we, have a call? Could we meet for coffee? Whatever it is, just have a chat can make. I know Mike and I've had a few chats in a few bars in a few places.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And that those connections are really important throughout your career. So so I would just say if anybody has a question or wants to chat about something or, drop me a line. I'm on lots of things. Um, but yeah, I think we're always willing as communicators, as professionals, we're always willing to sit and share and help where we can.
Super.
That's the thing about IABC too, that if there's one definition of what it's like to be an IABC, it's that IABC people take your phone calls.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate privilege you get out of membership in IABC, is that there's an unwritten expectation that if an IABC member contacts you in good faith, you take their call and you do what you can to help. And it works both ways. And that's the difference between being a member and not being a member.
Mm.
We've got an interesting, Nicholas, did you see it from Shuzana? I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Uh-huh. What would you recommend a comms person who needs to continue career in a completely different circumstances, like another language that's not her mother tongue? Well, I don't know if
Hmm.
you've had any experiences
Yeah, I moved to
along
Thailand
those
for
lines.
2 years and I sure didn't speak Thai. I picked up a little bit of it, but fortunately I was working in an English environment. But you do pick up, this is one of the things I was saying about being culturally aware
Mm.
and understanding the local culture, the local practices, the local and trying to fit in as opposed to make people, do what you do. It was huge education, one of the most valuable experiences I've ever had. But again, real eye opener. But also, look for people working in the field that you are in, make those connections, learn from them. What did you do? How have you found it? You can always use your little language translators and pick up a language, not that it's easy, but it is doable. But I found, and I've undertaken a few of those challenges, because when I moved here, because, oh, well, England is a lot like America. Not a chance. Totally different culture.
Mm.
Even the language is different. So, I say I can speak lots of different English, because you go around the world and people speak English in different ways. But I think being aware and open to that new experience, build your network, find people who work, in the area, ask them, what should I look for, a local professional association, because most places have them.
Mm.
And, get to know people has worked for me for a long time.
The
Super.
other thing is to work your own tribe, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
If you come into a different location, chances are there are other people who've come from your location or who speak your language or
Mm-hmm.
share some common cultural trait, whether it's religion or whether it's an interest. It may not be a comms thing, it might be something else. But just to get yourself into those conversations, get yourself into the networks, get yourself, you know, talking with people who've been through the same stuff you did. The main thing is, if you need to continue your career in completely different circumstances, don't do it alone.
Yeah.
Mm.
Make connections.
Super. Well, thank you very much. It's much appreciated. The time went by really quickly. We've already gone past the hour, and so I wanted to thank you both very much for joining us. I think it was a great discussion, and we're already planning ahead for the next online connects with in this case it will be with Monique Zitnik, with Shell Holtz and Neville Hobson, and we'll be
Mm-hmm.
looking at the AI and internal comms. And actually, it'll be a year after the publication of Monique's book, Internal Communications in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and that's going to be on May 7th. So I'll send everybody an invitation following this once we get that set up. And thank you very much, both of you, for joining, and congratulations once again.
Thank you very much.
Opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining as
Thanks.
well.
Bye.
I shall end.